Look at all these friends. Wonderful. Thanks for coming out.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this celebration of the publication of Curriculum Fragments, a Currere journey through life processes, written by Thomas S. Petter. I'm Kieran Forde, the chair for today, joining you from the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, which is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Along with our host, Bill Pinar, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube later today. Let me first introduce Dr. Petter. Thomas is a professor of curriculum studies in the Department of Educational Leadership at Miami University, Oxford, Ohio. While he modestly writes that he's merely becoming as a writer, we know him to be an author, scholar, and educator who is generous in his sharing of himself, a sharing through which we have all been invited to view and review ourselves and the other from a new perspective. Let me also introduce our panelists. Denise Talliaferro Baszile, Dean in the College of Education at Wayne State University. Morna McDermott, Professor in the College of Education at Towson University. And lastly, our chair, William F. Pinar. Thank you, Bill, for double jobbing this afternoon. A brief word about format, and then we'll get started. Over the next 20 to 30 minutes, Thomas will share a summary of his work with us. Next, Denise, Morna, and Bill will each pose a question for a discussion of around 10 to 15 minutes. Afterwards, if there's any time left to bring us to around the 60-minute mark, I'll ask if anyone else in the audience has a question. At that point, you may unmute and pose your question, or you can put it in the chat and I can read it aloud for you. Until then, please keep your device muted. So let's get started. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Kieran. I really appreciate that. And 20 minutes. If I get to 20 minutes and I'm not finished, just say wind it up, Tom, okay? Would you do that for me? Or kindly like just 5 minutes more. That's all we can take.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here and to have a book launch event put together and sponsored by Bill means so much. Dr. Pinar helped me get this book in place into fruition, like actually written. I really appreciate that, and wrote the foreword for the book. It meant a lot to me. And Denise and Morna, thank you so much for your colleagueship and friendship over these many years, and for responding to the book today, for reading it, taking the time in the first place to read it. I worried and stewed over what Bill would think of the book when I sent him the manuscript. I said I'm almost finished. He read it quickly and liked it, and it was such a relief to me to be asked to fulfill a contract for Routledge and write the book that I wanted. I've really wanted to write this book for a long time, and to get to do it, and to do it with such great guidance and support has been a great gift to me. I really appreciate it. My dogs are upstairs because they're a mess. They would be all over this room if they were here. My wife's out of town. I really downplayed this whole thing with her. Didn't want to make big deal out of how nervous I was and how excited I was. She's out of town, so she spared all the angst. Maggie Weller is a dear friend who's helping me get word about the book out, and it's the first time I've ever done that. She does proofing and editing and some publicity work too. So if you're interested in getting a hold of her, please let me know. And last, before I start, JCT's coming up, and the proposal deadline is Monday. So please get your proposals in for the October 17th through 19th meeting. It's my last as chair of the conference and editor of JCT. And Bill graciously and Mingfang He agreed to be keynote speakers at the event in Dayton. So I'm hoping to see everyone there. And of course, if you're interested in participating and writing for the Currere Exchange, we'd love to see your manuscripts. I'm going to mention that in a few minutes again too. So go ahead, Kieran. I'm ready for the slides. Thanks. Sorry for the delay there. You can hit the next slide. So how this book project got started, I think it's important to say a few words about that and to mention again Denise, who's really in the book a lot and is a very important part of my journey with Currere and as a writer and as a person. And a lot of energy congealed for us around the founding of the Currere Exchange in 2017 and the journal the very next year. And that work really propelled this project. There are antecedents to the project that I'm going to mention in a minute, but the Currere Exchange really had a lot to do with the energy I felt, not only for the ideas I was trying to put out or work through, but also in the field a little bit with the production of the journal and the ongoing interest in the annual meeting in June. And I wanted to thank her for that and for her energy and for her guidance and leadership all through. The internal push came from the fact that I was department chair when the journal started, and I wanted to keep my scholarly production going. I knew it was going to be difficult. I didn't quite know how hard it would be. If you're thinking about becoming a department chair, if you're in the room and you're thinking about it, don't think twice about it. But you have to have a plan. It was good for me to do it, but you have to have a plan for keeping your work going. And one of the plans I had was to work with Kelly Waldrop, the managing editor of the Currere Exchange Journal, to produce an article a year for the journal, to have her vet it, get it in shape to appear. And she was a great help along the way, really, to get the beginning of this book in shape. And if you haven't met Kelly, I hope you get to meet her at Bergamo this year. But Kelly is a great scholar in her own right and a fantastic editor, proofer, guide in writing. The emerging notion of curriculum fragments had been around inside of me and coming out of me all the way back to 2015 when I had a summer course at Miami that I taught about the standardization of the curriculum and how that was destroying American public education. And the students in that class began writing what I was calling then, for the first time, curriculum fragments. I needed to find a way to get students comfortable with writing regressive bits about their past that connected to the topic at hand. So we were energized and engaged in the topic of the over-standardization of the curriculum, studying curriculum theory, other practical pieces about schooling and how it was being shaped and reshaped by No Child Left Behind in particular. And the students really took to the first two-page assignment. Usually the assignments were short, so students could write something that they liked that wasn't a big paper. And that was really important, even for doctoral students, to feel confident getting started. And that book led to that work, and that summer course led to the book, Was Someone Mean to You Today, which is about it's about the standardization movement, especially in Ohio, and about my students' reactions to it and how it had impacted their own families and the world around them. And that book's still available, but it was really the start for me of thinking about how to use Currere with students and also how to think about small bits of educational experience that you couldn't let go of. That's what I really wanted students to focus on, were things that had to do with the topic at hand that they couldn't shake. What kinds of things were in their experience, to really visit the regressive, the past, and try to work through that to produce text. That work, however, was driven by an older frame that I had been working on for quite some time already, and a new frame that I'll say a word or two about here in a minute. Kieran, you can hit the slide. So the older frame I was working with and worked with all the way through Curriculum Fragments is Louise Berman's great book in 1968, New Priorities in the Curriculum. And that book hit me early in 2012 or 2013. I was back from an administrative position working on the faculty again at Miami, and I was given the opportunity to teach the curriculum theory seminar in our doctoral program. And the idea I had, after inheriting many, many books from Norm Overly's scholarly library at Indiana — Norm was my advisor at Indiana and lifelong friend — I started to think about um, how Schubert's work, the first 80 years, had had a framing impact on me. And when I was unloading all the books from Norm that he had gifted to me, I started to sort them by decade, like Bill did in his brilliant work in the early 1980s. And I started to see the possibility of a project emerging for that doctoral seminar, which became the project Curriculum Windows. So in those semesters, I taught the class over several years. Students would read curriculum books from a certain decade and then write what I hope would be Currere-oriented autobiographical treatments of those books as chapters of those books as chapters in our book series Curriculum Windows. We started with the 60s, 70s, and 80s, went back to the 50s because I realized I was missing the point about the 50s. I didn't give them much credit for much, and I was wrong about it from the very beginning and rectified that with our book, I think. And then the early 2000s, just recently the 2010s, and then a book about the books that we left out that two doctoral classes did with me in 2017 and 18. That project was inspired by the sorting of those books, and the first book that I sorted out was Berman's book. I picked it up and started reading it. I had never read it before. I didn't even know about it, even through my long doctoral studies career. And I was taken by it. I really liked her work. I liked her voice. I wrote about this in the book. I really give Berman a lot of credit for birthing me through this notion of life processes. There are some differences in our approach to the work and to the concept of life process, but it was a real inspiration to me and a really great book. And I just found maybe one of the last volumes of it online because I had the library's copy for several years, maybe 5 or 7 years. I finally gave it back after I finished the book and got my own copy. If you can find a copy, it's really worth reading. I hope maybe your library has it. She argued that life processes are ways of experience the world that can be learned functions in life that lead to richer experiences, become means to resolve conflict, and spur deeper learning. And she hoped that life processes, which she stories in the book, she really does a really beautiful analytical job with each of the 8 life processes that she surfaces, that they could be a heuristic that could guide the development of K-12 curriculum. So this is in the era of kind of a hopeful progressive period, I think, where scholars were thinking that K-12 curriculum could be guided by something other than traditional norms. And that book resonated. Unfortunately, it didn't probably get the traction it needed to get in practice. But she developed 8 processes: perceiving, communicating, loving, knowing, decision-making, patterning, creating, and valuing. And if you have a chance to read it, I really would encourage you to do so. I think it can be transformative and be a nice companion if you read my book. Next slide, Kieran. Thank you. So the newer format for framing life processes, I'm calling curriculum fragments, which is closely related to Currere and builds on Currere. So I wrote this on page 2. This book is primarily autobiographical with expository analysis informed by scholarship illuminating aspects of what I think are curricular aspects of my story. So the focus is on my educational and experiential connection to 7 life processes, 2 which overlap with Berman's: loving and knowing. So losing, knowing, forgiving, relating, hoping, growing, loving. Those are the 7 I story in the book. So in each chapter of Curriculum Fragments, a Currere journey through life processes has a structure. And I really worked on this after having the 6 articles that became chapters. The 7th I wrote was loving. I saved that to the very end. I've been working on that for a long time. I had more reading to do last year before I could write it. And a focus I had to really work through because I had a lot of things about love I wanted to say about my family that I decided I couldn't say, which I'm going to say something about on the 8th slide here. That really was torturous for me, trying to figure out how to write the the truth about loving without saying everything I wanted to say, which I decided not to. So each chapter has a naming, describing a life process section, which is rather brief at the beginning. At least most of them do. Every one of the chapters has a leading curriculum fragment or a story that I'm telling that embodies or is imbued by that life process. A reflective interlude where I'm trying to have an initial reaction to the story and what I think it might be about. And then a deeper analysis section that uses curriculum scholarship, authors, and other parts of the academic world to sort of make sense of it through analysis. And then a synthetical piece at the end that's either expository or another curriculum fragment that helps spur the reader on and or takes them deeper into what I'm trying to get at. So that's the format of the book. I feel like it's not laborious. I really like working on it. And I felt like it didn't replicate Berman, but it gave a bit of a feel that there is some structure to it, and not just me telling stories, which would be okay maybe if I was great at it. But in terms of doing the scholarly work I wanted to do, I felt like this format worked really well. Next slide, Kieran. Thanks. So Bill and I had this initial conversation about just south of Kemper Road, which is the title I had proposed for the book. He told me right away it wouldn't fly at Rutledge probably, and I laughed about that. I kind of knew that going in, but also Denise, before we started, commented that she knows the turn I'm talking about. There's a turn on Route 27 heading south from Oxford to Cincinnati, where I'm living now with the family, and it's beautiful at dusk. And it's hard to explain, it's kind of like it's just a 4-lane urban highway. But in Ohio, if you've never been to Ohio, many of the places that you're coming from are beautiful. But in Ohio, it has to me a rare beauty, certain parts of the year, especially in the fall. The leaves turning, the leaves falling all at the same time, the lights at dusk, the sun going down, the evening light. It's just stunningly beautiful. And when you're coming out of, if you're coming into Cincinnati, the cars coming out, it looks like the Field of Dreams, the last slide of Field of Dreams, the movie. That's the way it looks. And when I'm driving into it after class some nights in the fall, I'm thinking about what I'm going home to. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, was to describe the way I'm experiencing and theorizing the world as filled with, and this is complicated, but filled with beauty, awe, love, possibility, hope. And there's lots of work on those things in the field that I draw on to make some points about how it is we can recover some of those things, even when life processes take us down paths that are really torturous and difficult, like losing, and in the book, coming to know yourself and the vulnerabilities of your own humanity, which I didn't short in the book. I tried not to do that. It's not a pretty. Parts of the book are really ugly. And to me, they might seem tame to you, but they're ugly to me still. And they're fragments of my life experience that have guided me and shaped me that I can't shake. I can't let go of them. I'm going to refer to James Loder, one of my mentors during my seminary life. Before I became a teacher, I was a would-be pastor. And he wrote about convictional experiences in the early 1980s, and was influenced by him because I had convictional experiences where transformation occurred. And I felt like gathering up stories that were transformational, perhaps even convictional, were important on the continuum of life that reflects both really some negative aspects of our humanity and also the most beautiful. But at root, ultimately, what I wanted to do in the book was focus on reflection, and to think about how reflection is the centerpiece of Currere work and of the curriculum work that I'm trying to do. And it's not the hope that a life process, if we would theorize about it and story it even, could be the thing that guided planning or intentions or lesson plans, etc. But it would be the maybe one of the organizing principles that we would gather out from our own educational experiences, that we use reflection as teachers, as educators, as parents, as citizens, as people in the world, to understand ourselves better and perhaps even become better human beings. That's the path I'm on still. So this is what I'm doing at Root. I'm going to read this part. This is from page 16. Writing these curriculum fragments presents an opportunity for deep reflection and further study. And I trouble this a little bit in the book. And I also want to know what Bill thinks about this, but further study and study are critical, but I'm also including life experiences as an aspect of study, like studying your own experiences, thinking through it, working through it, doing something different next time, talking to people about it is an aspect of life experience that I think is related to study deeply. And study, reading, talking with others, exchanging ideas, building on them. I'm beginning with the autobiographical, which Berman really doesn't. I'm beginning with the story and with the describing, naming of life processes that are critical to me through the unfolding of my life journey in education in order to understand the nature of my educational experience. And that goes back to Bill's main question in the method of Currere. That is the primary commitment I'm making here as an educator and scholar. Then I try to figure out how the stories and any emerging notions of what life processes are and what they should be called fit together, what they signify, why they matter to me and may matter to the reader. Next slide. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Kieran, yell at me. So this is a Currere project in which I hold loosely to four steps. They're regressive, looking to the past; progressive, looking to the future, imagining it; the analytical, engaging in the now, the present; and the synthetical. It's a Currere project in which I incorporate implications of the work of other Currerists. Some of you are in the room. You're at least mentioned, if not referred to, generously. And there are several texts in the field that really helped guide me. I revisited Tour de Port curriculum for the second or third time in my reading before I was writing the final chapter. It really helped me write the opening and the final chapter. And in which I focus as much as I can on educational experience and not on intentions, not on planning, not on objectives, not on outcomes, which is really all that Miami wants me to do right now as a faculty member. And I'm soldier-like. I'm doing my work. I'm contesting and talking about different things all the time, but that's not what I'm doing in my classes. I mean, I have objectives, but who is teaching it? Who is teaching objectives? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me. Life is so interesting, complex, and ideas so amazing that in any grade, I think, if we're not paying attention to what the students are thinking and connecting with them, relating and moving, then we're lost. That is, I'm not hoping that readers take this work and focus on how to create more loving educational environments. For instance, I would like educational environments I'm in and that I'm helping foster be more loving, but through reflection, but I'm not making it with an objective, or I'm not doing it on purpose. I'm doing it as part of what is necessary in the scene, in the context. Through the reflection of scholars themselves to see whether loving imbues their experiences in education, to understand the degree to which loving drives their educational and ethical commitments to students and colleagues in practice or not, and to dream of ways in which their work and lives, if possible, could be more loving. Like taking the approach that, to me, is more authentically educative. And it begins with self-reflection. It begins with the self. It begins with our deep working through of ideas and possibilities. So if you were hoping that you would read another good recipe book, it's not a recipe. In fact, it's, by the end, mostly troubling. Next slide, Kieran. To me, at least. So there's a sense of peril when you write a book like this. I know Currerists who don't reveal themselves much. I don't blame them. it's torturous. I struggled with each one of the chapters on what I could say about whom, how to name them, how to position them ethically to protect them from me. Um, and what does the story say about me? When Liam Neeson was going through that horrible thing he went through that he caused by talking about his racist life, my wife said no one should ever talk about that racism like that. And I'm like, I agree, but I was doing it at the same time. I was surfacing some of these things that have to be dealt with by individuals. Our misconceptions, our preconceptions, our errors, our life mistakes, they have to be surfaced and reviewed. I did some of that work in this book, and the panelists may have something to say about all of that. Does the story perhaps put anybody in harm's way? How far can I go, and what's the price of vulnerability? I don't know yet. Not enough people have read the book. Maybe great, strong, trusted colleagues have, and they haven't told me to bag the book. Like, you shouldn't let that go. But there are parts of it that I still wonder about, and we'll see how that goes over the course of the next year before it's forgotten. Next slide, please. Thanks, Kieran. I have a couple of favorite moments in the book, and I'm going to say just a few words about them before I conclude. So I really liked writing the chapter on relating, and I use a story about my fifth grade teacher. She's the only person named in the book, Mrs. Kemp. That's her real name. I wanted people in my hometown to know how great she was. And even though in the chapter, there's a certain distance between us as teacher and student, we had personal interactions that really showed me the depth of which humanity can be expressed by a teacher through students. And at the end, in talking about relationships, I realized as I was revising this chapter, which had appeared as an article in the Currere Exchange previous, I realized that over the course of my career and writing about the loss of my father in 1976, I was just 13 when he passed from a heart attack. His first heart attack was in 74, which is when Mrs. Kemp and I had our lovely exchange. That I hadn't really dealt with the foundational aspects of my love for him. I hadn't really expressed that, maybe to people close to me, but not out loud. And I wanted to do that. And I think that comes through well in that chapter, especially the grace he showed me when I made an absolute terror of myself when I was 8 years old on the baseball field, actually swearing. And pastors' children were not to swear in public or any place. And the discipline he provided that night, which was full of grace. Never forgot that, and helped me become a better person and maybe a better parent. Chapter 9, writing about my immediate family, and especially about my two new grandsons, who are amazing. The only problem with being 61 is that I'm 61, and that I can't keep up with both of them at the same time. They're on the move, those two. And it's been such a joy to see all the kids in my family become. There are things that have happened in the family that I should write about. And I talk about some of these other aspects of family torment, especially like the loss of a parent. In the chapter on losing, I write about the loss of a parent and how difficult that was, and how there was nothing for us back then. I only had my own devices to survive it, and I did just barely. I probably teetered on the edge for probably 8 to 10 years after his losing him. But there are things to work on. I still need to work on that, and that chapter on loving's not finished. There are next steps to take. In the final chapter, chapter 10, Bonnie Wazolik's book, assemblages of violence really helped me deal with these tensions between violence and love. The quantum entanglements that we're in all the time as people floating on this terrestrial body at breakneck speed in so many different places at one time. How can we be at the same time filled with hate and also loving? How is that possible? And what do we do with it? How can we make sense of that and move in a way that could be more acceptable as a human being? I'm working on that every day. Sometimes it takes time to see where the differences and confluences are between acts of love and hate, between relating and being out of relationship, of growing and moving backwards. But the main thing is that we are becoming, and over time, I just wrote this part, and over time may occupy multiple positions on the continuum of these 7 life processes and others. The questions are, where have we been? Where are we now? Where might we be going? What do we hope for? And what are we willing to work for? Next slide, Kieran. Almost finished. This is the last slide, I think. So here's what I found out along the way. This is a 7-year-long project, and I'm thinking and wondering about these last things all through the book and maybe today, especially today, probably, that there could be more than 2 things happening at once. I'm convinced of that now, and I'm not a physicist. And I think the physicists have realized it's possible. Like Kierkegaard's question, how can the historical embody the internal? Like, of course, that's one of the mysteries of people in religious bodies and etc. But for all of us, as we wonder about our place in the universe, I think it's an important question. That violence, hate, and disaffection, this is Bonnie really helped me with this, can be overcome perhaps by other affects, which she writes about so brilliantly, such as joy, hope, and love. I hope you can take a look at her book, Assemblages of Violence. Really quite good. And helped me so much. That there is much power for movement in the double metaphor. This is Madeline Grumet in one of the chapters in her book with Bill, Toward a Poor Curriculum 76. The single metaphor of what happened, the significance of it, and the double metaphor of what the writer does with the memory of recreation, at recreation. I think that sort of embodies for me or expresses the journey that the Curreres is on when they're really working autobiographically to sensibly and as truthfully as possible and with as much vulnerability and honor to the truth, small t, the connection between the story and the story and its relationship to allegory, its relationship to deeper concepts and metaphors and possibilities, the figurative, all of it at the same time. That life processes are about movement, not stasis. And this is where Berman and I are really together on this, is that school, education, experiences in life should be about movement, not going back, not movement backwards either. Like going backwards and revisiting the past isn't a lack of movement, but what do you do with that work and experience? Because you can dwell in the nostalgic too long. How do you move forward with what you're learning and knowing? So how can reflection become something that helps us move? Memory work isn't about dwelling on the past. It's about movement now and in the future. Thank you, Kieran, for your help with that. And thanks everybody for your attention. And I just want to say thanks again for coming out and for listening and for being interested in the book. I'm trying to get the book price down. I may not be able to do that in the near future, but if anybody's close to St. Mary's, Ohio on September 18th, there's a hometown event around the book, and I'm going to have 60 copies there that Rutledge is helping me get, paperback books that you could get at that event if you're able to make it. Don't fly in from BC, Bill, because you're already coming in Dayton in October, but and you're going to get a copy anyway. But if you wanted to get a copy and read it ahead, you can also get the Kindle version or the digital version, which I think is moderately priced. Thank you, Bill.
All right. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Kieran.
We're going to move to the panel. I'm going to follow the running order from the flyer. So over to you, Denise.
Thank you. I'm going to just say a few words before I share my screen. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be in this conversation. It always feels good to come home to my curriculum studies family, whom I appreciate and love. So many of you here, and among them is Tom, who I think we've been such a force together. Not a lot of people in our space at Miami could understand the work that we were doing or appreciate the work that we're doing. But we found each other in that context, and held each other up, and then created our own space, which has attracted lots of new scholars into the space of curriculum studies. So I want to say this is a beautiful book. I've had peeks at little pieces of this over time, wherein Tom will say, "Can you just please read my work, please?" I know when you're doing this work, it's a really interesting space, because somehow it's your story and nobody's going to know it better than you. But having the little bit of affirmations along the way seem to help you along the way, especially when it gets to the really hard and vulnerable pieces of the work. So I think it's a beautiful book. I was right in it with you in so many spaces there. And you're a wonderful writer. I can remember reading a chapter out of the book you wrote when you were running for office. And it made me laugh out loud. And it made me also, sort of be there with you at this old woman's front door, trying to ask for her vote. And you bring that same kind of detail and patience and insight, I think, to this book as well. My favorite chapter, my quote comes from that chapter. My favorite chapter in the book is Losing. And I did have an opportunity to read this fragment. Not all of this was my first time reading all of the analysis of it, but I had an opportunity to read the fragment early on, I think, probably in some of its first iterations. So I'm going to tell you, like, when I read this chapter, I felt like I understood everything about Tom Petter, because the way I know Tom is he wears everything out on his shoulders, and he's super passionate, but he's passionate even when he's wrong, and he's passionate when he's right. He is just super passionate, but and sometimes a colleague or a student might say, but Tom did this and that wasn't, and I'm like, but Tom knows. Like, Tom will say, "I'm working on it." He would say to me all the time, "Denise, I'm just the old white guy working on it." And that I appreciate that more than anything, because we could be in a space of, where we're mutually acknowledging that we're both on a journey, and learning and growing. I always like to talk about, Bell Hooks talks about radical subjectivity. I always like to talk about radical intersubjectivity, and thinking about the ways that you become because of the relationships in your life, because of the people you're growing with and alongside, and even rubbing up against in a uncomfortable way that spurs your growing along. So this chapter, Losing, really helped me just understand a lot about Tom, and understand a lot about sort of the development, I think, of our friendship. So here's the quote. Let me see if I can. You all see?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so In all, is it big enough?
Yeah, we can all see that clearly.
Okay. And all of that is rational, analytic, and true to some degree. But as I have learned to deal with loss, I have realized that the intensity of the pain of loss bleeds into others' lives, sometimes unintentionally. I played basketball to ease my pain, but much of that play was intense, to burn out the fear of being alone, to strong arm my initial hate for God out of my heart and mind for stealing my father, and to try to channel the aggression and anger I felt so it didn't come out at the dinner table or at school or church. I could have cracked up any minute in grief, and sports helped me deal with loss in ways that I couldn't have dealt with loss anywhere else at that time in my life. I really like that quote because, again, it's this sort of intersubjective space where, you know, your loss shapes you, you interact with other people, and it shapes them. And so a way that you sort of, you know, touch on this sort of in-between space that we all are. You know, we are never just ourselves. We're also all these other combinations of selves. So my question, when I first read this chapter, I thought, wow, Jason is a metaphor for Tom's father, is what struck me. And it's interesting that you said you still haven't been able to write fully about your dad. And that's interesting to recognize in the last chapter when you start with the losing of Jason, your friend, but ultimately your father in the first chapter. So here's the question. How has this loss bled into your relationships, especially with your students? How has it shaped Tom, the teacher?
Well, I think I'm supposed to answer that, right, Bill? It's not rhetorical. I'll tell you this, Denise. I really appreciate you seeing me and getting it, and for asking this question. So it's so the problem is that type of deep loss bleeds into everything.
Mm-hmm.
You could maybe put a tourniquet on it. You might be able to treat it with therapy. You might be able to hide from the world, still bleeding out on everybody all around you. And I think the thing that I've come to understand about myself is that I'm bleeding out and that I need others. I need them. I don't want to be angry all the time. I don't want to be so passionate about winning that point that I lose a good friend over it. I think I did hurt Jason in that moment because I was just too much to handle. And I feel like um, I might have a superpower or two. One of them might be that I come on strong with students. They kind of like that, but that I'm really deeply bleeding. And so I need them as much as they need me. And I think that probably there's that sort of mutual respect and care and love that I'm trying to cultivate in trying to build more relationships around me as opposed to losing them. Because I don't really like losing them, and I have lost a lot. So I think that the whole thing imbues my pedagogical approach and my relational approach with students all the time. I hope they're not all in the room today. Like, oh no.
Well, Scott's here. I see Scott here, so.
But I think that's part of the vulnerability part. Like saying those things and implying the possibilities of them and how they bleed out into is somewhat dangerous a little bit, because like I don't think I'm at risk of cracking up, but I'm at risk of not being fully and wholly the person I'm meant to be, which is the kind, caring, hopeful person filled with possibility. That's what I'd like all my students to be too, and to act that way as much as they can, especially in our program. You know what I mean? Like the doctoral students who come through and the students of teaching that come through my teacher leadership classes. I'd like them to learn to be the best of themselves, regardless of what they're bringing to the table, or on top of it, maybe not regardless. Regardless suggests that you can maybe discount or push it aside. It's not possible to put those things aside. You have to work through them. And of course, Bill's concept in the Currere journey of working through is critical. Holding things in abeyance. I think that's what it means, to make sense of it. I think it takes time. And so I'm working on 50 years of loss and trying to convert it all into something beautiful.
And the power is in being there with the students to do it together. Because if you were going into that space already distancing yourself from the loss or thinking of yourself as healed, then maybe they wouldn't get as much out of the experience, nor would you.
Greatly appreciate your insight, Denise. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. And we'll move over to Morna next.
Hi, everyone. I never like following after Denise. It's not fun. But I was so inspired by the idea of talking about loss, and that wasn't some of the notes and the ideas that I had prepared for today, but it did make me think very reflectively in the last 10 minutes that two of the pieces that I've created over my time in curriculum theory as a scholar, one of the first things I ever wrote, which I was still a doc student, and one of the most recent things that I wrote about a year ago, both have to do with loss. The first was about the loss of my father, and it kind of came out of nowhere. But I think to date, after all these years, it's still one of the most impactful things that I've ever written that have changed the way I think about things. And then more recently, writing about the loss of my mother, and grateful to, shout out to Currere Exchange, which is the kind of space where you can publish that work, and it was about, losing my marbles. And funny enough, it was a reference to Bill's article from many decades ago called The Lost Language of Cranes. But after reading it in 1999, I flipped it and called it The Language of Lost Cranes, and thought, like they're all wandering around wondering where they're going. But all of that kind of came together in like a hot moment. And to what Denise was saying, when we write from places of vulnerability that are true to us, those are the things that stay, because they're real. They're not scripted. And so I just had so many thoughts as you both were sharing. To Tom and Curriculum Fragments, and to all of you, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. When Tom asked me to review, read, give my thoughts about Curriculum Fragments, honest, my first thought was, well, first he said, will you read it? Will you review it? I was like, yeah, I'd love to. And then about an hour later, maybe a day later, I wrote it back. I was like, which book is this again? Because there are so many. And it's not like there's big gaps of time between them. Like, this is the one from 2022. There's like 5 from 2022. So honestly, they all kind of fold together in a very kaleidoscopic sort of way. And because I've known Tom for so long, I'm familiar with some of those stories. And so it was funny. It was like, no, it's the Curriculum Fragments. I was like, oh, okay. And I was really moved by it. I was really impacted by the stories. Some of I was kind of familiar with, and very familiar with Tom's style, but then also changed and really informed by other aspects of it that I had not known about. And God, I just found so many points of entry. I think what I like to do is start by reading the passage that I really liked, and then hop over and share with you a couple random unassembled thoughts that I have about it. So I'm going to share. Let me see if I can do this. I'll never get used to it. Here we go. So I just pulled up the book myself, and I wrote, is on page 156, and it's kind of long, but it's just so exquisite. And it's after he's talking about reference to Kierkegaard and his notions of faith. But Tom writes, how do we make sense of the idea of the historical and the eternal colliding, coinciding, coexisting? I jumped right on that because my favorite book over the last 30 years has been Milan Kundeра's The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which has been wrestling with that tension. And so I just grasped onto that with some deep affection. How do we make sense of lives that are finite as having infinite, timeless qualities? And why do we hold to such things, know them, but believe in them? If I hadn't been rebaptized by an empathetic divinity in the rain in my driveway while gripping a slippery rubber basketball, what would I know of the eternal? What faith would I have? What kind of life would I be leading or committed to if not ever faced with the paradox, the double metaphor, the dialectic of life? And how can we make any sense of so many conflicting surfaces colliding all at once in the moment and over time? Like, for an instance, the presence of something otherworldly that grips you in this world, the actual loss of my beloved father who carried pizza home in the rain, the appearance of the love of my life climbing up the bleacher steps of a crowded gymnasium to claim me out of sheer loss, and learning through various crucibles of life wherein others lost and gained as well, the ever-present promise of the eternal in the lives of students and family members, the ongoing fact of a world in turmoil with greed and death and destruction around nearly every corner, and the sheer truth that just as I understand what is going on, at least a little bit, my life will end as well. All of this is clearer, though, because I'm taking a curricular point of view using Currere, thinking through life's events, making sense of them, and developing ways of viewing the world through reflection that help me to survive and thrive. It's possible to get caught up, paralyzed, unable to move, but the point of the work is movement, not stasis. And it goes on. I don't even know where to cut that off because it just keeps going on in this amazing eloquence. But that really moved me because it made me think of the work that matters the most to me and what I know of the power in Tom's narrative. Like, that's the analysis piece. And so I had that's not it. That's my lesson plan for next week. I knew I was going to lose it. Here we go. So I had a whole bunch of notes, some of which make sense and some don't, but there is a question at the end of it. One thing I started thinking about was the title of Fragments, and how I just looked it up, in Wikipedia. It's pieces, things that are incomplete, broken, or separated. And the way that Tom kind of brings those together, they start as little mosaic pieces, but they pull together. And when I did Tom's review, I wrote the word meander. And when I first sent that to him, he was like, I don't like that word. I was like, we're going to keep it because I meant something by it. And I know that it has a negative connotation. Like when you're meander, it's like, I'm lost. But, I always think about Alan Bloch's notion of getting lost in curriculum, what it means to wander or to meander. And I think it is movement oriented, and everybody has been speaking to that already, this idea of movement, of doing the work. And meandering isn't a bad thing. You even say on page 21, Tom, if you hadn't moved out of your office, you never would have found the Buckeye. So there is this idea of meandering that is not necessarily negative. And then I try to hold that up against what you talked about later about the quantum, the superposition, and that meandering among the fragments is like being open to alternative understandings. And so it's in becoming, it's about getting lost in memories that we don't know yet, but that know us and appear to us when they're ready to be found, and more importantly, ready to be understood. And so this is what I think about when Tom was referring to the idea of the double metaphor. There are certain memories that come to me at certain times for a reason. That's the time at which they are ready to be understood. And so, in other words, we do not pick up that which we are not ready to carry. And there are times when narratives present themselves to us because we are now prepared to do the work associated with the recollection, the remembering, and the other phases of Currere, the synthetical and the progressive. Those are the harder pieces of the work. What do we do now after we've done the recollection? And so all of those four phases of Currere really do speak to this quantum theory of light being both a wave and a particle, and how Tom articulates the in-betweenness of space and time to know where one is, but yet where one is not, and not, or to not yet know where one is, even if you think you know where you're going, right? So it's just fantastic conundrum. And to try to frame it in these 7 processes. So what I wanted to know, in general, after just taking all of that away from my general reading of it, is you use these 7 processes to frame each of your stories. And I wondered what would happen, and I want to give you the homework assignment to try this later at home on your free time. If you were to reshuffle the processes, right? So you have love and growing and forgiveness, and loss, and you have these 7. And you wrote about each of them. But what if you were to shuffle those and take the story that you wrote about loss, but rewrite it or reread it through the frame of loving? Or take the one about growing and reframe it under through the lens of loss? Would that change? What would that, or how would that change the narration or the understanding of it? Would it put things to the foreground and move things to the background? Because all of those 7 processes are interconnected, but I wanted to play with reframing them by shuffling the lenses, if that makes sense. Not that you can do that right now on the spot with 43 people on the call, but I'd like to challenge you to play with that as an extension of the brilliant work.
Oh,
So
thank
it's
you,
kind of a
Morna.
question, like what are your initial thoughts of that process, or how do you think you react to that idea?
Well, my study of I read 5 or 6 books about loving and tried to take stock of everything I'd read about love in my academic career and life. From Hooks, King, Baszile, others. And I would say that this doesn't answer your question, really. I like the idea of reshuffle, and think about what the possibilities are for how the story arc might change, or how the trajectory of understanding might change. I think that's really interesting, Morna. But I would say that one of the things I've learned is that all of it is about love. And I'm not just coming to that. I've known that all along. I think the life processes, heuristics, or framework put love all together in one chapter, perhaps, but it's all about love. Like, so the chapter about Jason is also about love, right? Because the loss of him was all bound up in other things that were happening that were loving, that are in the chapter. So that's one of the things I might say, is that no matter how I would shuffle these all together, I would say that this may be too big of a leap. Anything educative is connected to love and a human understanding of the other in a deep way that abides and endures in presentness, unconditionality, like caring and being in relation without condition, like that. Like, that's what I would say. Like, that should be like one of the threads that you would pick out if you read the book, that it's constantly there. And I think I always knew that, but the reason I don't follow Denise at a meeting is that she's going to say something like that ahead of me, and which she did at one of the Currere exchange openings. I don't know if you remember this, Denise. It's the last time I ever let you go first, because you said how the Currere journey was about love. I don't know if you remember that, but it was just brilliant, and I just have never shaken it. I was inspired by that, and I think that is reflected in the book. But Morna, that's a really great question. I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time.
All right, thank you both. And as we're just running the hour here, we'll shift to Dr. Pinar.
Thank you, Kieran. And if you'll share that screen. Again, congratulations, Tom. You write that curriculum fragments are quoting a small bits of memories of life and educational experience that continue to stick to me, that persistently influence my thinking and actions in my personal and professional lives. I'm intrigued by that word stick, wondering, what do you imagine the adhesive to be? Something in you, I suppose, but maybe not entirely or always conscious? Or is what makes these bits adhere to you, is that they affirm what is or could be essential in your life, reminding you to remain attentive, even faithful to them? That implied when you write in the next sentence that such fragments, quoting, guide to some degree how we all proceed, take the next step, think of the past and present while moving, and the dream of the future, and perhaps even act now to change the course of our experience in history. In that sense, are these bits what's missing in you and or in your life? So they function as intended destinations, steering you this way or that? Finally, in your next and concluding sentence, we read that these bits constitute the curriculum of our educational lives, conceivably an inchoate theory of curriculum, namely that curriculum could inculcate sensitivity in students to what their course of study sticks to them. In what way? Loosely, tightly, and for how long? So, your comments on any of this?
Thanks for keeping that up, Kieran. I want to look back at it. Thank you for that. And Bill, thank you so much for the insights and the framing of this. The first thing I wrote down when you were talking, when you asked that question, the one that's embedded in the long paragraph, I'm intrigued by that word stick. Guide to some degree how we all proceed. I was thinking about the word check. That's implied in the next sentence. Like, these are the things that are missing. So if I'm impatient, I might think of a time when patience buoyed me, and someone jumping to a conclusion could have really hurt or destroyed me, right? Like, all of that possibility embedded in human relation. And so I thought of that I think probably bits, on the surface at least, reflect perhaps the adhesive is they're missing, or they're reflecting on something missing which existed, or that existed in greater quantity, or somehow was more guiding, or more directional, or more a part of you than others or you think you have in you. Like, I had colleagues early on. I thought I've always had the executive gifts to be in a leadership position in the university. When I was going for the chair job, two of my colleagues said, we don't think you have the patience not to blow up at people. And I said, I promise that I won't do that. Because I hadn't, Denise was there for some of these things that happen in department meetings, like, I just couldn't let stand things that were inconceivably wrong. And I would always say something about it, probably to my detriment. And maybe that's leadership. I don't know. But I think they're checks, like, to me, and that maybe doesn't give them enough power. I don't know if that makes them smaller, but I think that's what I would say back about that brilliant line you wrote there. I'd like to see, I want to make sure that Kieran sends me that. Okay.
Yeah, of course.
I don't
Well,
know if I've answered your question or not, but it's made me
well,
think a lot
it
about.
really wasn't a specific question. I was just curious what your comments might be. But it seemed early on, before the rift on leadership, you were talking about what might be missing, that Hisu, and that's very interesting, isn't it?
It is.
Because it also implies, and I'm thinking of Mora's question, that loss or simply absence can be converted into a kind of guiding light,
Mm,
as a
mm.
kind of a semi-conscious steering mechanism. I'm curious to what extent then we should be very attentive and not try to block out feelings that are unpleasant or unwelcome, such as because in fact they may prompt us to search in a certain way or not. Just speculating.
No, I think the insight there in terms of the word choice is attentiveness. I think that's really important.
Mm.
And so we know people who we might make judgments about in terms of this or that thing they may or may not have. You might think that person's not being attentive to the fact that X, Y, or Z is dominating the way that they're being perceived or acting in the world, etc. Like all being like, and I'm thinking about that all the time. Like, to what degree am I attentive to who I am and what I'm doing? And how do I check myself when I move one way or the other in ways that may not lead to or be present in the moment completely? Like, one check is perhaps how are my reactions to or connections with or working with um, a person or a group imbued with unconditional acceptance of them. Like, really, like, am I attentive to that? I'm constantly struggling with that, staying attentive. And I don't think it's possible. My brain's not big enough or strong enough, perhaps, to be aware of everything all at once. Usually it happens later when I am filled with regret or insight. And then the cycle begins of, to what degree am I the kind of person who will seek forgiveness for that? Is it warranted? Like, does the person even know? Do they even care? Is it even warranted? Like, what are the possibilities? I think we know now from all the things that we're going through in the world, all the violence and all of the conflict that we're engaged in, from close at hand disagreements to world conflict, that there is something powerful about entities that are attentive to the other despite. I think probably that's where the most love exists, the kind that can keep humanity from destroying itself, us, each other, and perhaps even warring states. I don't know. I'm thinking a lot about that. Go ahead.
I think you do know, and I think it's a lovely note on which to end. Back to you, Kieran.
Thank you, Bill.
Yes, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Tom, for sharing your work with us today. And thank you very much to our panelists, Denise, Morna, and Bill as well. I've dropped in the chat there the recording from today will be on YouTube, and there's the recordings from previous sessions if you care to check them out, and also a link to the Curriculum Studies in Canada website. And so that's all for today. Thank you also to our guests for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out. It's great to see you. Thanks to the panelists. What great insights and questions. Thank you for that.